I'm Madison Clarke, 28 years old, and 3 months ago I watched my parents hand my sister Sarah everything I'd ever dreamed of: $80 million, a Beverly Hills mansion, and a cherry red Tesla Model S. I stood there in their marble foyer, clutching a $500 gift card to Target, wondering what I'd done wrong my entire life. But that stranger's envelope I received 2 weeks later? It contained documents that didn't just change everything, it shattered the very foundation of what I thought family meant, revealing a betrayal so deep it made their favoritism look like child's play. Before we dive into how my perfect family's facade crumbled into the most satisfying revenge story you'll ever hear, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below, smash that like button if you're ready for some serious family drama, and don't forget to subscribe because this story has more twists than a pretzel factory. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes out. Growing up in the Clarke household felt like living in two different worlds. Sarah, my older sister by 3 years, inhabited a realm where everything sparkled with possibility. I existed in the shadows, watching from the sidelines as she collected accolades, praise, and an endless stream of gifts that seemed to materialize from thin air. Our childhood home in Connecticut was a testament to Sarah's achievements. Her bedroom occupied the entire third floor, complete with a walk-in closet that rivaled most department stores and a study area equipped with the latest technology. Meanwhile, I shared the second floor with a guest bathroom and a room that hadn't been updated since the 1990s. When Sarah wanted piano lessons, our parents hired a private instructor who came to the house 3 times a week. When I expressed interest in guitar, they handed me a $20 acoustic from a garage sale and told me to figure it out. The disparity became more pronounced during holidays and birthdays. Sarah's Sweet 16 was an elaborate affair with a live band, professional photographers, and over 200 guests. She received a brand new BMW convertible with a giant red bow, the kind you see in car commercials. My 16th birthday was celebrated with dinner at Olive Garden and a cake from the grocery store. The gift? A used Honda Civic with 150,000 miles on it, which my parents presented as teaching me responsibility. College applications revealed the true extent of their favoritism. Sarah applied to Ivy League schools with full financial backing, private tutors for her SATs, and professional consultants to craft her essays. When she was accepted to Harvard, our parents threw a celebration party that rivaled some weddings. My acceptance to a state university was met with a casual, "That's nice," over breakfast, and I was told I'd need to take out student loans because it builds character. Throughout high school and college, I convinced myself this treatment was somehow justified. Maybe Sarah was naturally more deserving. Perhaps I just wasn't trying hard enough. I internalized every slight, every overlooked achievement, every moment when my parents' attention was elsewhere. When Sarah graduated summa cum laude and I finished with honors at my state school, the difference in their reactions was telling. Sarah's graduation was a multi-day celebration with extended family flying in from across the country. My graduation was attended by just my parents, and we went to Applebee's afterward. The professional world only amplified these patterns. Sarah landed a position at a prestigious consulting firm in Manhattan, thanks largely to connections our father had cultivated over decades in business. I started at a nonprofit in Hartford, earning a fraction of her salary, but finding genuine fulfillment in community work. Yet somehow, Sarah's corporate success was constantly celebrated while my achievements in helping underprivileged families were politely acknowledged and quickly forgotten. Family gatherings became exercises in endurance. Every conversation eventually circled back to Sarah's latest promotion, her new apartment in Soho, her exotic vacation destinations, or her seemingly endless parade of successful boyfriends. When relatives asked about my life, the responses were brief and quickly redirected. "Madison's doing well at her little nonprofit," my mother would say, as if my work helping families secure affordable housing was a cute hobby rather than a meaningful career. The financial disparities were impossible to ignore. Sarah's student loans were mysteriously paid off within 2 years of graduation. When she wanted to buy her first apartment, our parents provided the down payment as an early inheritance. Meanwhile, I was still making monthly payments on my modest educational debt and saving every penny for a studio apartment that remained perpetually out of reach in Connecticut's inflated housing market. Friends and distant relatives occasionally commented on the obvious favoritism, but I'd learned to deflect with humor or change the subject entirely. Acknowledging the inequality felt like admitting there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some inherent flaw that made me less worthy of love and investment. It was easier to accept the narrative that Sarah was simply special, destined for greatness, while I was ordinary, reliable, pleasant, but ultimately forgettable. The emotional toll of this dynamic was something I carried silently for years. Therapy helped me understand that seeking validation from parents who were incapable of providing it was a losing battle, but understanding something intellectually and healing from it emotionally are entirely different processes. I dated men who were emotionally unavailable, chose friends who took more than they gave, and consistently undervalued my own worth in both personal and professional settings. By my late 20s, I'd built a life that was modest but meaningful. I had a small apartment, a reliable car, and work that mattered to me. I'd learned to find validation from within and from people who actually saw my value. But the sting of family gatherings never fully faded, and the hope that my parents might someday recognize my worth lingered like a persistent ache. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March while I was reviewing grant applications at my desk. My mother's voice carried an unusual excitement as she invited me to dinner at their house that weekend. "Your father and I have something important to discuss with both you girls," she said, using that particular tone that suggested this was more than their typical family dinner. Sarah arrived at the family home in her latest luxury car, a lease upgrade she'd mentioned casually during our last phone conversation. I pulled up in my 7-year-old Subaru, the same reliable vehicle I'd been driving since college graduation. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone, least of all our parents, who rushed to admire Sarah's new ride while barely acknowledging my arrival. Dinner conversation followed its predictable pattern. Sarah regaled everyone with stories from her recent promotion to senior associate, the corner office with Manhattan skyline views, and her weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard with colleagues. I shared an update about securing funding for a new affordable housing project, which earned polite nods before the conversation inevitably returned to Sarah's accomplishments. After dessert, our father cleared his throat with the gravity of a man about to deliver momentous news. "Girls, your mother and I have been doing some estate planning, and we've decided not to wait until we're gone to distribute our assets." The words hung in the air as Sarah and I exchanged glances, both sensing this conversation would be significant. "We've been incredibly blessed," our mother continued, "and we want to see you both enjoy the benefits of our success while we're still here to witness it." She reached for a folder on the credenza, her hands trembling slightly with what I assumed was excitement. The documents inside would reshape our family dynamic in ways none of us fully anticipated. Sarah was called forward first, naturally. The list of assets being transferred to her was staggering. The Beverly Hills mansion they'd purchased as an investment property 5 years earlier, now worth $15 million. A diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds totaling $65 million. The cherry red Tesla Model S our father had been eyeing for months, and various other holdings including art, jewelry, and collectibles worth several million more. I watched my sister's face transform as each asset was described in detail. The mansion came fully furnished with pieces from renowned designers. The investment portfolio included shares in tech companies our father's firm had helped take public, and the Tesla was loaded with every available upgrade. Sarah's hands shook as she held the property deed, her eyes filling with tears of joy and disbelief. "We know you'll use these resources wisely," our father said, embracing Sarah as she sobbed into his shoulder. "You've always been so responsible with money, so focused on building wealth and making smart investments. We have complete confidence in your ability to manage this inheritance." Then it was my turn. The anticipation was almost unbearable as I stepped forward, wondering what portion of the family wealth would be entrusted to me. Perhaps it wouldn't match Sarah's inheritance exactly, but surely there would be significant assets, maybe the Connecticut house or a substantial investment account. My mother handed me a much thinner folder. Inside was a Target gift card for $500 and a handwritten note expressing their love and confidence in my independent spirit. The contrast was so stark, so completely one-sided, that I actually laughed, a short, nervous sound that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. "We know you've always prided yourself on making your own way," my mother explained, her voice carrying a defensive edge I'd never heard before. "You're so capable, so resourceful. We didn't want to rob you of the satisfaction of achieving success through your own efforts." The explanation felt hollow, a rationalization dressed up as wisdom. I stood there holding a gift card that wouldn't cover a week's groceries while my sister clutched documents representing generational wealth. The message was clear. Sarah was the daughter they wanted to invest in, to set up for life, to shower with abundance. I was the daughter who should be grateful for the opportunity to struggle. Sarah, to her credit, seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the disparity. "Mom, Dad, this seems," she began, but our father cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Madison understands," he said firmly. "She's always been the independent one, haven't you, honey?" The question wasn't really a question. It was a statement disguised as seeking agreement, a way to make me complicit in my own marginalization. I nodded because what else could I do? Making a scene wouldn't change their decision and would only confirm whatever narrative they'd constructed about my character. But inside, something fundamental shifted. The little girl who'd spent decades trying to earn their approval finally understood that the game was rigged, that no amount of effort or achievement would ever level the playing field. The drive home was a blur of conflicting emotions. Hurt, certainly, but also a strange sense of clarity. The pretense was over. The careful dance of family harmony that had required me to minimize my own needs and celebrate Sarah's every success was finally revealed for what it truly was. A performance designed to maintain everyone else's comfort while slowly eroding my sense of self-worth. That night, I called in sick to work and spent hours walking through my neighborhood, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. My parents hadn't just given Sarah money, they'd given her security, freedom, and the power to make choices without considering financial consequences. They'd given her the gift of never having to worry about retirement, medical bills, or economic downturns. What they'd given me was a gift card and a lecture about character building. The weeks following the inheritance announcement passed in a haze of forced normalcy punctuated by moments of jarring reality. Sarah's social media transformed overnight into a carefully curated showcase of her new lifestyle. Photos of the Beverly Hills mansion's infinity pool, the Tesla's sleek interior, and spontaneous shopping trips to Rodeo Drive filled my feed with painful regularity. Meanwhile, I returned to my routine at the nonprofit, but everything felt different. Sitting in budget meetings where we debated whether we could afford a new printer, while knowing my sister now had access to more money than most people could spend in several lifetimes, created a surreal disconnect from reality. My coworkers noticed my distraction, but I couldn't begin to explain the situation without sounding bitter or unhinged. The family group chat became a constant source of anxiety. Our parents shared every detail of Sarah's new life with obvious pride. Sarah's having the kitchen renovated with Italian marble, and the Tesla's autopilot feature is amazing. Sarah gave us a demonstration. Each message felt like a small knife twist, a reminder of the vast canyon that now separated my sister's reality from my own. Phone calls from Sarah became increasingly awkward. She tried to maintain our relationship's previous dynamic, but every conversation was now filtered through the awareness of our dramatically different circumstances. When she complained about having to choose between two interior designers or debated which vacation destination to visit first, I found myself struggling to respond with genuine interest or sympathy. "I know this is a huge adjustment," she said during one particularly uncomfortable call. "Maybe I could help you out a bit? Just to even things up a little." The offer was well-intentioned, but somehow made everything worse. I didn't want to become my wealthy sister's charity case, receiving occasional handouts to make her feel better about the disparity. "I'm fine," I assured her, a phrase that was becoming my default response to everything. "Mom and Dad are right, I've always been independent." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but maintaining some dignity felt more important than accepting pity money from someone who'd won the family lottery through no merit of her own. Work became my refuge, but even there, the inheritance situation cast a shadow over everything. When my supervisor mentioned the possibility of a promotion that came with a modest salary increase, I found myself calculating how long it would take to save what Sarah had received in a single afternoon. The math was depressing. Even with significant raises and decades of careful savings, I'd never approached the security she'd been handed without effort. Family gatherings became exercises in performance art. Our parents would gush about Sarah's latest purchases or experiences while I smiled and nodded appropriately, playing the role of the supportive sister who was genuinely happy for everyone's good fortune. The strain of maintaining this facade was exhausting, but breaking character felt like admitting defeat. Friends began to notice changes in my behavior and mood. When they asked about family dynamics or why I seemed distant lately, I deflected with vague references to stress at work or general life transitions. The truth was too complicated and painful to share, and part of me worried that voicing my resentment would make me seem petty or ungrateful. The worst moments came during quiet evenings alone in my apartment. I'd scroll through Sarah's Instagram posts featuring her new life of luxury while sitting in my modest living room, eating dinner from a can and calculating whether I could afford to replace my worn-out couch before winter. The juxtaposition was almost comical in its extremity, if it weren't so emotionally devastating. Sleep became elusive as my mind replayed decades of memories through a new lens. Every instance of favoritism, every overlooked achievement, every subtle message that I was somehow less worthy of investment now seemed like building blocks in a long-term plan to justify this ultimate inequality. Had my parents always intended this outcome? Had they been preparing Sarah for wealth while conditioning me to expect less? The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire situation. Sarah was too invested in enjoying her new lifestyle to truly understand my perspective. Our parents seemed genuinely puzzled by my subdued reactions to their generous gift of a Target card. Friends couldn't relate to the specific dynamics of sibling inheritance inequality. I felt completely alone with an anger that seemed to grow larger and more consuming with each passing day. Professional counseling might have helped, but the irony of needing therapy to process my family's wealth while being unable to afford quality mental health care wasn't lost on me. I researched sliding scale options and waited lists for community services, adding yet another item to the growing list of things Sarah could access immediately while I had to strategize and wait. The breaking point came during Easter dinner when our father casually mentioned setting up a trust fund for Sarah's future children, hypothetical grandchildren, who would inherit millions before they could walk, while I'd received a gift card that was already spent on groceries. The generational implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Sarah and me anymore. It was about establishing permanent inequality that would affect family dynamics for decades to come. That night, I made a decision that would prove prophetic. I started documenting everything. Not out of any specific plan for action, but because the situation felt too surreal and too painful to trust to memory alone. I began keeping detailed notes about conversations, saving screenshots of social media posts, and maintaining a record of every instance where the inheritance disparity affected family interactions. I also started researching inheritance laws, not because I had any immediate recourse, but because understanding the legal framework helped me process the emotional reality. What I discovered was that parents have nearly absolute discretion in how they distribute assets, and adult children have virtually no legal standing to challenge inheritance decisions unless fraud or mental incapacity can be proven. The research was both educational and discouraging, but it also planted a seed of curiosity about our family's financial history that would prove significant later. How exactly had my parents accumulated such substantial wealth? Their careers had been successful but not extraordinarily lucrative, and I'd never been aware of investments or business ventures that would generate the kind of assets Sarah had inherited. These questions would have remained academic curiosities if not for the stranger who appeared at my apartment door 2 weeks later, carrying an envelope that would transform my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my family. I was heating up leftover Chinese takeout on a Thursday evening when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw an older woman in her 60s wearing a conservative business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She didn't look like someone selling anything or proselytizing, so I opened the door with the chain still attached. "Madison Clarke," she asked, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. When I nodded cautiously, she continued, "My name is Patricia Hoffman. I'm an attorney from Atlanta, and I have information about your family that I believe you need to see." The words sent a chill down my spine. Family secrets delivered by mysterious lawyers and evening visits felt like something from a thriller novel, not my mundane real life. But Patricia's demeanor was professional and serious, not dramatic or threatening. "I understand this is unusual," she said, noting my hesitation. "I've been trying to decide whether to contact you for several months. The inheritance announcement your sister posted on social media finally convinced me that you deserve to know the truth about your family's wealth." I removed the chain and invited her inside, my curiosity overcoming my caution. Patricia settled onto my worn couch and opened her briefcase, revealing several manila folders thick with documents. "What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear," she began, "but it concerns the source of your parents' assets and why the inheritance was distributed so unequally." She handed me the first folder. "These documents relate to your grandmother Elena Clarke's estate from 1998. I vaguely remembered Grandma Elena, my father's mother who had died when I was young. She'd lived in a modest house in Georgia and had always seemed comfortably middle class, but not wealthy. According to Patricia, that assessment was completely wrong. Your grandmother was an extremely wealthy woman," Patricia explained. "She owned several properties, had substantial investments, and possessed a collection of jewelry and art worth millions. When she died, she left very specific instructions about how her estate should be distributed." My hands trembled as I opened the folder and began reading the legal documents. Elena Clarke's will was detailed and explicit. Her entire estate, valued at over $100 million in 1998 dollars, was to be divided equally between her two granddaughters, Sarah and Madison, with the assets held in trust until each reached age 25. The blood drained from my face as I processed the implications. "But I never received anything from Grandma Elena's estate," I whispered. Patricia nodded grimly. "That's because your parents never told you about it. They were named as trustees of the inheritance, responsible for managing the assets until you and Sarah came of age. Instead of honoring your grandmother's wishes, they absorbed your portion of the inheritance into their personal wealth and told Sarah that her inheritance came directly from their own success." The room seemed to spin as I absorbed this revelation. Not only had I been cheated out of my rightful inheritance, but my parents had been living off stolen money for over 25 years. The mansion, the investments, the lifestyle that had enabled them to give Sarah $80 million, it was all built on assets that should have been mine. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Patricia consulted her documents. "With growth and compound interest over 25 years, your original inheritance would now be worth approximately $180 million. Your parents essentially stole your entire financial future and then gave a portion of those stolen assets to your sister while making you feel grateful for a Target gift card. The cruelty was breathtaking in its scope. They hadn't just favored Sarah over me. They'd built their favoritism using money that was rightfully mine. Every luxury Sarah had enjoyed growing up, every advantage she'd been given, every dollar of the recent inheritance had been funded by assets stolen from my grandmother's intended bequest. Why didn't you contact me sooner? I asked, still struggling to process the magnitude of this betrayal. Patricia sighed deeply. I was Elena's attorney and friend. When your parents took control of the estate, they assured me they would honor her wishes. I moved to Florida shortly after and lost track of the situation. It wasn't until recently, when I was settling my own affairs, that I decided to research what had happened to Elena's granddaughters. She handed me printouts of news articles and social media posts documenting Sarah's recent inheritance and lifestyle. When I saw that Sarah had received millions while you got nothing, I realized your parents had never followed through on their promises. Elena specifically wanted both her granddaughters to have equal opportunities and financial security. She would be heartbroken to know how her wishes were ignored. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Patricia had maintained copies of all original estate documents, correspondence with my parents, and records showing how the assets had been transferred and managed over the decades. She'd even discovered recent financial statements showing that my parents had used Elena's money to make the investments that funded Sarah's inheritance. What can I do about this? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be complicated. The statute of limitations for most estate fraud claims has passed, Patricia admitted. However, there are exceptions for cases involving trustee fraud and concealment. You would need to hire your own attorney and be prepared for a lengthy legal battle, but you have a strong case for recovering your stolen inheritance. As Patricia packed up her documents, she left me with copies of everything and her contact information. Elena was a remarkable woman who worked hard to build wealth she could pass on to future generations. She specifically wanted her granddaughters to have equal opportunities and never struggle financially. Your parents stole that gift from you, and you deserve to fight for what's rightfully yours. After she left, I sat in my living room surrounded by documents that proved my entire life had been built on a lie. My parents hadn't just been unfairly favoring Sarah, they'd been systematically stealing from me while convincing me to be grateful for their scraps. The modest lifestyle I'd been conditioned to accept, the financial struggles that had shaped my character, the career limitations imposed by student loans and low wages. All of it was unnecessary suffering inflicted by people who were supposed to protect and provide for me. The emotional whiplash was intense. Rage at the betrayal mixed with grief for the lost opportunities and life I should have had. But underneath those feelings, something else was growing, a determination to reclaim what was mine and ensure that justice was finally served. I spent the rest of the evening researching estate attorneys and reading everything I could find about trust fraud and inheritance disputes. If my parents thought they could steal my birthright and get away with it forever, they were about to discover just how wrong they'd been. The same independence and resilience they'd claimed to admire in me was about to become their worst nightmare. Hey everyone, I can see from your comments that you're as shocked as I was by this revelation. Before we continue with how I decided to fight back, I just want to take a moment to thank you all for the incredible support. If you're finding this story as unbelievable as I still do sometimes, please hit that like button to help others discover it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time because the next part is where I really started fighting back, and let me tell you, my parents had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the entire day contacting attorneys who specialized in estate fraud and trust disputes. The conversations were both encouraging and sobering. Several lawyers confirmed that I had a strong case for trust fraud, but they also warned that litigation against family members is emotionally brutal and financially expensive. After consulting with 5 different firms, I chose Margaret Chin, an attorney whose reputation for handling complex inheritance disputes was legendary in legal circles. During our initial consultation, she reviewed Patricia's documents with the sharp focus of someone who'd seen similar cases before. This is one of the most egregious examples of trustee fraud I've encountered, Margaret said, spreading the papers across her conference table. Your parents didn't just mismanage your inheritance, they deliberately concealed its existence and converted it for their personal use. That's criminal behavior, not just civil wrongdoing. She explained the legal strategy in detail. We would file a civil lawsuit seeking to recover my stolen inheritance, plus interest and damages. The case would argue that my parents had breached their fiduciary duty as trustees and engaged in constructive fraud by concealing the inheritance's existence. Additionally, we could potentially pursue criminal charges for trust fund theft, though that would require cooperation from the district attorney's office. The financial aspect of litigation was daunting. Margaret's firm required a $50,000 retainer to begin work, with total costs potentially reaching 6 figures depending on how aggressively my parents chose to fight. However, she was confident enough in the case's merits to accept a partial contingency arrangement. If we won, her firm would collect a percentage of the recovered assets. While Margaret began formal legal preparations, I faced the challenge of continuing my normal life while building a case against my own family. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. I still loved my parents despite their betrayal, and the prospect of destroying our family relationships forever weighed heavily on my conscience. Sarah presented the most complex emotional challenge. Should I tell her that her recent inheritance was funded by money stolen from me? Would she even believe such an accusation against our parents? And if she did believe it, would she be willing to return assets that weren't rightfully hers? I decided to approach her carefully, starting with general questions about our grandmother and the family's financial history. During a coffee meeting the following weekend, I brought up childhood memories of visiting Grandma Elena. "Do you remember much about her house in Georgia?" I asked casually. Sarah shrugged. "Not really. I was pretty young when she died." "Why?" "I was just thinking about her lately, wondering what happened to her things after she passed away." "Did Mom and Dad ever mention her leaving anything to us?" Sarah's expression suggested the question had never occurred to her. "I don't think so. I mean, she seemed comfortable but not wealthy, you know? I always assumed Dad's success came from his own business ventures." Her genuine ignorance about our grandmother's wealth confirmed that she was as much a victim of our parents' deception as I was, albeit one who had unknowingly benefited from their crimes. This realization complicated my feelings about the entire situation. Sarah wasn't a co-conspirator, she was an unwitting recipient of stolen assets. Meanwhile, Margaret's investigation was revealing additional disturbing details about our family's finances. Our parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd used it as seed money for investments and business ventures that had generated millions more in profits over the decades. The Beverly Hills mansion Sarah now owned had been purchased with my grandmother's money. The investment portfolio was built on assets that should have been mine. "They've essentially been running a Ponzi scheme with your inheritance for 25 years, Margaret explained during one of our strategy sessions. "Every dollar of profit they've made can be traced back to assets stolen from your grandmother's estate." The scope of financial damages was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested I was owed over $200 million when factoring in compound growth, lost opportunities, and punitive damages for the fraud. The number was so large it felt abstract, but Margaret reminded me that recovering stolen assets wasn't about the money, it was about justice and accountability. As the legal machinery began moving, I had to make difficult decisions about how much to reveal to friends and extended family. The situation was too complex and emotionally charged to explain casually, but I also needed emotional support during what promised to be a lengthy legal battle. I chose to confide in my closest friend, Jessica, who had witnessed years of family dynamics and would understand the context of what I was facing. Her reaction was a mixture of outrage and validation that helped me feel less isolated in my anger. "I always thought your parents treated you unfairly," she said after I'd explained the entire situation. "But this is beyond favoritism. It's theft and psychological abuse. You have every right to fight back." The pre-litigation phase involved extensive financial discovery as Margaret's team worked to trace the movement of assets over 2.5 decades. Bank records, investment statements, property deeds, and tax returns painted a clear picture of how my parents had systematically converted trust assets for their personal benefit. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a series of emails between my parents and their financial advisor from 2010, discussing whether they should come clean about the inheritance situation when I turned 25. My father's response was chilling. "Madison has never expected anything from us anyway. She's built her own life and seems happy with less. Why complicate things now?" The casual dismissal of my rights and financial future was devastating to read, but it also strengthened my resolve to pursue justice. They hadn't just stolen my money, they'd made calculated decisions to continue the theft even when given opportunities to make things right. Margaret scheduled a formal mediation attempt before filing the lawsuit, following standard legal protocol for family disputes. The mediation would give my parents one final opportunity to resolve the situation without public litigation, though both Margaret and I doubted they would agree to fair terms. "They've gotten away with this for 25 years, Margaret observed. "People who commit fraud at this level rarely admit wrongdoing voluntarily. They'll probably try to gaslight you and claim the inheritance never existed or that your grandmother intended for them to have discretion over the assets." As the mediation date approached, I found myself both dreading and anticipating the confrontation. For the first time in my adult life, I would be sitting across from my parents as equals, armed with evidence of their crimes and represented by legal counsel. The little girl who had spent decades seeking their approval was about to demand they account for a lifetime of lies and theft. The emotional preparation was almost as intense as the legal strategy. I practiced staying calm and focused while discussing painful details, knowing that my parents would likely try to manipulate my emotions and paint themselves as victims of an ungrateful daughter's greed. But I was no longer the grateful daughter who accepted scraps and apologized for wanting more. I was a woman who had discovered the truth about her stolen birthright, and I was prepared to fight for every dollar they'd taken from me. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Margaret's conference room, neutral territory where emotions might remain somewhat contained. I arrived early, my stomach churning with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. This would be the first time I'd seen my parents since learning about the stolen inheritance, and I wasn't sure how I'd react to looking at their faces while knowing what they'd done. They walked in together, dressed in their finest clothes and accompanied by their attorney, a silver-haired man whose expensive suit and confident demeanor suggested they were taking this threat seriously. My mother's face was carefully composed, but I caught a flicker of fear in her eyes when she saw the documents spread across the table. My father maintained his usual authoritative posture, though his jaw was set in a way that betrayed his tension. Margaret began with a professional overview of my claims, presenting evidence methodically while maintaining a tone that was factual rather than accusatory. She outlined the timeline of events, from grandmother Elena's death in 1998 through the recent inheritance distribution, highlighting each instance where my parents had failed to honor their fiduciary duties as trustees. The effect on my parents was immediate and telling. My mother's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide how pale she became as Margaret displayed copies of the original will, bank records showing asset transfers, and correspondence proving they'd been aware of their obligations. My father's attorney took copious notes, but his increasingly grim expression suggested he understood how damaging this evidence would be in court. "These allegations are completely unfounded," my father finally interrupted, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone I'd heard my entire life. Elena's estate was properly administered according to her wishes and applicable law. Madison is misinterpreting documents she doesn't understand. Margaret's response was swift and devastating. She produced a letter in my father's own handwriting to Elena's attorney, dated just 6 months after her death, promising to ensure both girls receive their full inheritances when they reach maturity. The letter explicitly acknowledged that Elena had left equal bequests to her granddaughters, and that my parents were serving as trustees until we came of age. "Would you like to explain how honoring Elena's wishes involved giving Sarah $80 million while giving Madison a Target gift card?" Margaret asked, her professional composure barely concealing her contempt for their behavior. My mother began crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone caught in an indefensible lie who was trying to evoke sympathy. "We always intended to take care of both girls," she said through her sobs. "Sarah needed more help because she was more ambitious, more focused on building wealth. Madison was always so independent, so proud of making her own way." The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. Even confronted with irrefutable evidence of their theft, they were still trying to frame their crimes as somehow being in my best interest. Margaret had warned me they would attempt this psychological manipulation, but experiencing it firsthand was still shocking. "Let me make sure I understand your position," I said, speaking directly to my parents for the first time since the mediation began. "You're claiming that stealing my $180 million inheritance was actually a favor because it forced me to develop character through financial struggle." My father's face reddened with anger at my tone. "We didn't steal anything from you, Madison. We made investment decisions that benefited the entire family. You've had a good life, a meaningful career, and we've always supported you." "Supported me?" I laughed, the sound echoing harshly in the quiet room. "You gave Sarah millions of dollars in advantages from childhood through adulthood, all funded by money you stole from me. Then you handed her another $80 million while giving me a gift card and lecturing me about independence. That's not support, that's systematic theft disguised as parenting philosophy. The mask was finally slipping. My father stood up abruptly, his attorney placing a restraining hand on his arm. "You ungrateful, jealous little," he began, but Margaret's sharp interruption cut him off. "I strongly advise you not to finish that sentence," Margaret said coldly. "This mediation is being recorded, and any threats or verbal abuse will be included in our court filings." The room fell silent as everyone processed what had just happened. My father's outburst had revealed his true character more clearly than hours of legal arguments could have. Here was a man who had stolen millions from his own daughter and was now angry that she had discovered his crimes. Their attorney whispered urgently in my father's ear, clearly trying to salvage what remained of their negotiating position. After several minutes of hushed consultation, he addressed Margaret directly. "My clients are prepared to discuss a settlement that acknowledges some discrepancies in how the estate assets were managed. Perhaps we could arrange a payment plan that would provide Madison with additional financial support while avoiding lengthy litigation." Margaret's laugh was sharp and humorless. "A payment plan to return stolen money? Mr. Harrison, your clients didn't mismanage assets, they committed felony theft. We're not negotiating the return of some disputed funds. We're demanding the restoration of a $200 million inheritance plus damages for 25 years of fraud." The number hung in the air like a physical presence. My mother's sobbing intensified, while my father seemed to shrink into his chair as the full scope of his legal exposure became clear. They had expected to face an ungrateful daughter seeking some additional financial help, not a victim of massive fraud armed with irrefutable evidence and competent legal representation. "That's an impossible demand," their attorney protested. "My clients don't have access to that kind of liquidity, and the statute of limitations." "The statute of limitations doesn't apply to ongoing fraud with concealment," Margaret interrupted. "Your clients have been actively hiding this theft for 25 years and continuing to benefit from the stolen assets. Every day they've failed to disclose the inheritance has been a separate criminal act." The mediation continued for another hour, but the outcome was predetermined. My parents' attorney made increasingly desperate offers, $5 million, then $10 million, then $20 million, all framed as generous settlements rather than partial restitution of stolen assets. I rejected each offer, not out of greed, but because accepting anything less than full restoration would validate their narrative that this was a family dispute rather than a criminal matter. As we prepared to leave, my mother made one final attempt to manipulate my emotions. "Madison, sweetheart, please don't do this to our family. Think about what this will do to Sarah, to your father's reputation, to all of us. We can work something out privately without destroying everything we've built together." The plea was masterfully constructed to push every button they'd installed in me over decades of emotional conditioning. The old Madison might have felt guilty about pursuing justice if it meant family consequences. But the woman sitting in that conference room had moved beyond seeking their approval. "You destroyed our family 25 years ago when you decided to steal my inheritance," I replied calmly. "I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth about what you've done." Walking out of that building, I felt lighter than I had in months. The confrontation I dreaded had actually been liberating. My parents had shown their true characters under pressure, confirming that my decision to pursue legal action was not only justified but necessary. Margaret filed the lawsuit 3 days later, and the media attention was immediate and intense. "Millionaire parents sued by daughter for $200 million inheritance fraud" was the headline that appeared in newspapers across the country. Social media exploded with commentary about family betrayal, inheritance disputes, and the psychology of parental favoritism taken to criminal extremes. The public scrutiny was both validating and overwhelming. Thousands of people reached out with their own stories of family financial abuse, creating an unexpected community of people who understood the unique pain of being betrayed by those who were supposed to protect you. The attention also brought additional evidence to light, as former family friends and business associates came forward with information about my parents' suspicious financial behaviors over the years. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source: Sarah herself. The phone call from Sarah came at midnight, 3 days after the lawsuit hit the news. Her voice was barely recognizable, shaky, tearful, and filled with a devastation I'd never heard from her before. "Madison, I need to see you. I found something in the mansion's safe that changes everything." We met the next morning at a coffee shop halfway between our homes, both of us looking like we hadn't slept in days. Sarah's usual polished appearance was replaced by sweatpants and dark circles under her eyes. She carried a manila envelope that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in her trembling hands. "I've been going through everything since the lawsuit became public," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found Mom's personal papers in the safe, including letters she wrote but never sent. Madison, they knew exactly what they were doing. They planned this entire thing." She handed me photocopies of letters my mother had written to herself over the years, a twisted form of journaling where she worked through the guilt of stealing my inheritance. The entries spanned decades, documenting her internal struggle with their crimes and her rationalization of why Sarah deserved the stolen assets more than I did. One entry, dated from my college graduation, was particularly devastating. "Madison seems content with her simple life. She doesn't need wealth the way Sarah does. We've given Sarah the tools to build an empire, and she's using them brilliantly. Maybe Elena would understand that we gave her money to the granddaughter who could multiply it rather than the one who would waste it on charity work." Reading my mother's private thoughts about my career and character was like being stabbed by someone I'd trusted my entire life. She hadn't just stolen my money, she'd convinced herself I was somehow unworthy of it because I'd chosen meaningful work over wealth accumulation. "There's more," Sarah continued, pulling out additional documents. "I found records showing they've been using my inheritance to cover bad investments they made with your original trust funds. Madison, most of the $80 million they gave me doesn't even exist anymore. They lost your money in risky ventures and gave me assets that are leveraged to the hilt." The revelation was staggering. Not only had my parents stolen my inheritance, but they'd also gambled it away and then created fictional wealth to give Sarah, essentially running a Ponzi scheme that was destined to collapse. Sarah's newfound wealth was largely an illusion backed by debt and assets that would disappear once creditors realized the true financial situation. "I can't keep any of this," Sarah said firmly, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I'm going to testify on your behalf and help you recover everything that should have been yours. I've already contacted Margaret's office to arrange a meeting." The transformation in Sarah was remarkable. The sister who had lived her entire life as the favored child was voluntarily giving up her advantages to support my fight for justice. She understood that her relationship with our parents would never recover, but she chose to do the right thing anyway. Margaret's team worked with Sarah to unravel the complex web of financial fraud our parents had constructed over decades. Sarah's cooperation provided access to documents and accounts that would have taken years to discover through litigation. The evidence painted a picture of systematic theft, money laundering, and securities fraud that extended far beyond the original inheritance dispute. The criminal investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Federal prosecutors became involved when the scope of financial crimes became clear, and my parents found themselves facing potential prison time in addition to civil liability. Their expensive attorney couldn't explain away decades of documented fraud, especially with Sarah's testimony contradicting their version of events. The settlement negotiations that resumed 6 months later bore no resemblance to the insulting offers from the initial mediation. Facing criminal prosecution and civil liability that could have reached $300 million with punitive damages, my parents agreed to surrender virtually all their assets to restore my stolen inheritance. The final settlement was complex but comprehensive. I recovered $185 million in assets, real estate, and investments, less than I was technically owed, but more than enough to restore the financial security my grandmother had intended me to have. Sarah retained a small portion of assets that could be traced to legitimate gifts from our parents' pre-fraud earnings, enough to maintain a comfortable but not lavish lifestyle. More importantly, the truth was finally public. My parents' reputations were destroyed, their social circle abandoned them, and they faced the consequences of decades of lies and theft. They avoided prison time only by cooperating fully with asset recovery and agreeing to ongoing financial monitoring to prevent future fraud. The emotional healing took much longer than the legal resolution. Sarah and I rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual support rather than the artificial dynamic our parents had created. We started a family foundation together, using a portion of the recovered assets to help other victims of financial abuse and inheritance fraud. My relationship with our parents was irreparably damaged, but I found peace in knowing that justice had been served. They had to live with the knowledge that their crimes had been exposed and that they'd lost both their stolen wealth and their daughter's respect. The psychological manipulation that had controlled my entire life was finally broken. The nonprofit work that had sustained me through decades of financial struggle became even more meaningful when I could fund it properly. I expanded programs, hired additional staff, and created initiatives I'd only dreamed of when operating on shoestring budgets. The career my parents had dismissed as charity work became a legacy of positive impact that no amount of stolen money could have purchased. Looking back on this entire experience, I'm struck by how long injustice can persist when victims don't know their rights or don't have resources to fight back. My parents counted on my ignorance and financial limitations to protect them from accountability. They never imagined that their carefully constructed lies would be exposed by a stranger with a conscience and a manila envelope full of evidence. The most valuable lesson from this experience isn't about money, it's about self-worth. I spent decades believing my parents' narrative that I was somehow less deserving of love, investment, and support than my sister. Discovering the truth about the stolen inheritance forced me to confront how deeply I'd internalized their emotional abuse and how it had shaped every aspect of my life. Now I wake up every morning knowing that I was never the problem. I wasn't less worthy of their love or financial support. I was the victim of parents who were willing to commit felony theft against their own child to maintain their preferred family dynamic. That knowledge is more liberating than any amount of money could ever be. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had been lying to you for years? How did you handle finding out that your entire relationship was built on deception? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us process the betrayal and move forward stronger. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others who might be dealing with similar family situations find it. Subscribe to the channel because I'll be sharing more stories about standing up to injustice and fighting for what's right, even when it means confronting the people closest to you. And please share this with anyone who needs to hear that they deserve better treatment from their family members. Thank you for listening to my story and supporting my journey from victim to survivor to someone who fights back. Remember that you're never obligated to accept mistreatment just because it comes from family. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for their actions, even when it's painful for everyone involved. Here's to family karma, justice served, and the power of truth to set us free from even the most elaborate lies. Stay strong, keep fighting for what's right, and never let anyone convince you that you deserve less than your worth.